The waiting room chairs were the hard plastic kind that make your back ache after 20 minutes. I'd been sitting in one for almost 2 hours. My phone was at home. I had set it on the kitchen counter before my procedure, thinking I wouldn't need it, thinking my daughter-in-law would be here by 3 o'clock the way she had promised. It was nearly 5 now. The afternoon light was going flat and gray through the hospital's sliding glass doors, and the woman at the reception desk had already asked me twice if everything was all right. I told her yes, both times. Old habit. Women my age learn very early that admitting you've been left somewhere is its own kind of humiliation. I was 67 years old, sitting in the lobby of Mercy General with a bandaged arm, no phone, $40 in my wallet, and a daughter-in-law who had decided, apparently, that picking me up simply wasn't worth her afternoon. What Nicole didn't know, what almost nobody knew, was that I had been a silent partner in her company for 11 years. Let me back up. My husband Gerald passed 8 years ago. Heart attack. Quick. Merciful in its way. Though nothing about losing him felt merciful at the time. We had built something together over 30 years, not flashy, not the kind of wealth that announces itself at dinner parties, but real, careful, compounding wealth. Gerald was an engineer. I spent my career in corporate finance before stepping back to manage what we had built privately. We lived modestly on purpose. Nice neighborhood, sensible cars, a house that was paid off. Daniel grew up thinking we were comfortable, which was true, and ordinary, which was not. After Gerald died, I reorganized everything quietly. The attorneys handled it. The accounts were structured in ways that were legal and deliberate and essentially invisible if you didn't know where to look. I did this not out of secrecy for its own sake, but because Gerald had always said, and I had come to believe deeply, that money shown too early invites exactly the wrong kind of attention. Daniel is my son. He is 41 years old and a genuinely good man in most of the ways that matter. He coaches youth baseball on weekends. He calls me every Sunday. He cried at his father's funeral in a way that was not embarrassed or restrained, and I loved him more for it. The problem with Daniel is not Daniel. It never has been. He met Nicole 4 years ago at a conference in Atlanta. She works in marketing senior director now at a mid-sized pharmaceutical company called Veriline Solutions. She is polished and quick and says the right things in the right rooms. When they got engaged, I made myself look at her honestly, the way you have to when your son brings someone home, and every instinct you have as a mother is fighting your desire to just be happy for him. What I saw was a woman who had decided very precisely what kind of life she wanted and was going to curate every element of it. That's not a character flaw by itself. Ambition is fine. Planning is fine. What made me uneasy was something harder to name: the way her eyes moved around a room before she smiled, the way she asked questions that were actually assessments, the way she looked at me, specifically, with a particular brand of patience that I recognized from years in boardrooms. It was the patience of someone waiting for an obstacle to become irrelevant. I said nothing. I smiled. I helped plan the rehearsal dinner. The first year of their marriage was fine from the outside. They bought a house in a suburb outside Columbus. Nicole got promoted. Daniel seemed happy in the way men sometimes seem happy when they are actually just busy. I visited on holidays and noticed small things: how Nicole would redirect conversations away from me, how plans would change last minute in ways that always seemed to leave less time for my visits, how Daniel would look briefly uncertain when I brought up something we had once talked about easily, as if the topic had been quietly reclassified. None of it was the kind of thing you can point to and say, "Here, this is wrong." It never is, with people like Nicole. Last fall, I had a minor vascular procedure scheduled. Routine, the doctor said. Outpatient. But they wanted someone to drive me home because of the sedation. Daniel was supposed to come, but 2 days before, he called apologetic, genuinely apologetic. I could hear it to say a work emergency had come up and he couldn't get away. Nicole had offered to come instead. He seemed relieved to have solved the problem. I told him it was fine. Nicole picked me up that morning pleasantly enough. She asked about the procedure in the clipped, efficient way she asks about most things, as if gathering data. She dropped me at the entrance with a quick squeeze of my arm and said she'd be back by 3. 3 o'clock came, then 3:30, then 4. The bandage on my arm was starting to pull at the skin in a way that wasn't quite pain but wasn't comfortable either. The sedation had mostly worn off, leaving the particular tired flatness that follows any medical procedure. I asked to use the phone at the nurse's station and called Daniel's cell. It went to voicemail. I called our home landline, which nobody uses anymore but which I've kept because old habits die slowly. No answer. I called Nicole's cell from memory. I'm good with numbers. Always have been. She picked up on the fourth ring. Oh, she said. And there was a pause that told me everything. I completely lost track of time. I'm so sorry, Margaret. Daniel just got home. We'll figure something out. I asked if she was coming to get me. Another pause. It's just, dinner is almost Daniel was asking about. I actually think there might be traffic on 71. A small, apologetic laugh. Would you be okay grabbing a rideshare? I know it's not ideal. I feel terrible. She did not sound like she felt terrible. I said I would manage. I said goodbye. I sat back down in the plastic chair and looked at the $40 in my wallet, which was not enough for a rideshare home, and thought about what to do. The woman at the reception desk, young, dark-haired, tired at the end of a long shift, offered to call me a cab and gave me a cup of water without being asked. Her name tag said Rosa. I thought about how much more dignity this stranger was extending to me than the woman who would someday inherit alongside my son. I borrowed Rosa's phone. The first call was to my attorney, a man named Charles Whitfield, who has handled my affairs for 14 years. The second was to Raymond, my financial advisor, who picks up on the first ring for me regardless of the hour. The third call was one I'd been considering for some time. Because here's what Nicole didn't know about Veriline Solutions, the company where she'd spent 6 years building her career and was currently positioned to become a VP by spring. 11 years ago, a man named Arthur Benson came to Gerald and me looking for silent investment partners. Arthur was brilliant and underfunded, and building what would eventually become Veriline from a rented office space in Cincinnati. We gave him the capital he needed in exchange for a minority equity stake, structured quietly through one of our holding entities. Arthur built something worth building. The company grew. It went through 2 acquisition attempts and came out independent both times. The stake Gerald and I held had appreciated considerably. More relevantly, when the current ownership group restructured 3 years ago, my position through the holding entity gave me a seat on the advisory board that almost no one below the executive level would have any reason to know about. Nicole had spent 6 years at a company where I had influence, and she had never thought to look. She had looked at me and seen a pleasant, aging widow who could be managed with occasional dinners and strategic availability. She had seen, I suspect, someone who could eventually be administered the power of attorney conversation, the estate questions, the gradual assumption of responsibility that sometimes looks like care and is sometimes something else entirely. She had not done her homework. That was her first mistake. The second was leaving me in a hospital lobby with $40 and a borrowed phone. I did not make any calls that evening that burned anything down. I want to be clear about that, because revenge for its own sake has never interested me. What interested me was accurate information and the quiet movement of pieces into better positions. I have been playing this particular kind of game since before Nicole was born. I took a cab home. Rosa helped me find a service that accepted a credit card by phone, and I sat in Gerald's old study with a cup of tea and started making notes. Methodical. No emotion, or rather, emotion channeled into usefulness. Gerald used to say I was the most dangerous person he'd ever met in a business context, not because I was aggressive, but because I was patient. Daniel called the next morning, full of apology. Nicole, apparently, had told him there had been a miscommunication about the time. He believed her because he wanted to, and because the alternative was uncomfortable. I listened to him apologize, and I was, genuinely, calm. I told him I was fine. I asked about his week. I did not mention what I had begun, the night before, to set in motion. Over the following 3 months, I had several conversations I'd been postponing. One was with Arthur Benson, who was still involved with Veriline in an advisory capacity. We'd stayed in friendly contact over the years. I mentioned, in the course of a longer conversation, that I'd recently learned a member of the marketing senior leadership was a relation by marriage. Arthur was surprised. I wasn't surprised that he was surprised. I told him I had some concerns that I'd prefer to discuss in proper channels, and that I would be formalizing a request for a governance review through my board position. A governance review sounds dry. What it actually means, in practice, is that auditors start looking at things: expenses, decision trails, vendor relationships, the particular gray areas where ambitious people tend to cut corners when they believe nobody important is watching. I'll tell you what they found, not because I want to dwell on it, but because you should understand that what Nicole had been doing had nothing to do with me. She had been manipulating vendor contracts in ways that benefited a consulting firm with quiet ties to her former colleague. Small amounts, individually, significant, collectively. The kind of thing that's easy to miss when no one is looking and impossible to explain when someone is. I want to be precise. I did not plant this. I did not fabricate it. I asked people with proper authority to look carefully, and what was already there is what they found. During those 3 months, I also had a different kind of conversation with Daniel. Not about Nicole, at first. About us, about the distance that had been growing between us that I think he felt but hadn't named. I asked him to come alone one weekend, which he did, though I heard later that Nicole had not been pleased about it. We sat on the back porch where he used to play as a boy, and I asked him a direct question. Did he feel, honestly, that things were the same between us as they had been 4 years ago? He was quiet for a long time, long enough that I knew he had been waiting for someone to ask. He said no. He said he wasn't sure how it had happened. He said that every time he tried to think about specific instances, they seemed small individually, and it was only the pattern he could see, and he didn't know what to do with a pattern you can't point to. I told him that was exactly right. I told him to trust that. What happened at Veroline happened in February, quietly, the way these things happen when done correctly. Nicole was presented with findings from the governance review. She was given the choice between resignation and a longer, more public process. She chose resignation. The details were sealed. She does not know, to this day, who requested the review, or why it began when it did. She may suspect. I imagine she suspects. But suspicion without proof is just a feeling. And feelings don't hold up in boardrooms. Daniel found out about the resignation before Nicole had decided how to present it to him. A colleague of his happened to mention it. These things ripple outward in ways that can't always be controlled. He called me that evening, and the call lasted almost 2 hours, and parts of it were hard. He asked me questions. I answered honestly. He cried. A little, the same way he'd cried at his father's funeral, not embarrassed, not restrained. I let him. I didn't tell him everything that night. Some things take time to earn the right to tell. What I did tell him was this. I had spent 40 years making careful decisions about money and structure and privacy, not because I didn't trust him, but because his father and I had agreed that what we'd built should be protected from exactly the kinds of pressures that wealth creates in families when it's visible too early. I told him that the night Nicole left me in that hospital lobby, I'd borrowed a stranger's phone to make sure everything I'd worked to build was positioned correctly. Not out of anger, out of clarity. He asked me why I hadn't told him about any of it, the business interests, the structure, the Veroline connection. I told him that some of it I'd planned to tell him when the time was right, and some of it I was telling him now, and some of it would come in stages as he was ready for it, the same way his father and I had always done things. He was quiet again. Then he said, Mom, how much did you know about Veroline? I told him enough. That spring, Nicole moved out. The divorce was civil in the legal sense, and not particularly civil in any other sense. Daniel handled it with more grace than I expected, and less collapse than Nicole seemed to have anticipated. He spent more weekends in the town where I live. We started going to the farmer's market on Saturday mornings the way he and Gerald used to, years ago, and I found that I had missed it more than I'd let myself know. He asked me once, standing in front of a table of early strawberries, whether I felt bad about what had happened to Nicole's career. I thought about it honestly before I answered, which is the only way I know how to answer that kind of question. I said, Nicole made choices over 6 years at a company she would have known I was connected to, if she had looked. She made additional choices about how to treat a woman she had decided was not worth her serious attention. The governance review found what it found because it was there to find. I did not manufacture Nicole's character or her decisions. I only made sure the people who needed accurate information had it. Daniel nodded slowly. He bought 2 pints of strawberries. He gave one to me. Dad would have liked this, he said, meaning the morning, I think, and the market, and possibly also the careful way things had resolved. I told him his father would have loved it. There are things I've thought about since. In the quiet of the house at night, when it's easy to revisit decisions and wonder whether you did right, I've wondered whether I should have said something to Daniel earlier, some warning that was more direct. I've wondered whether a different kind of mother would have been louder, more immediate, more willing to make a scene in the hospital lobby or on the phone that afternoon. I've wondered whether any of it would have mattered. What I keep coming back to is this. I was 67 years old in that plastic waiting room chair, and I was alone, and a stranger offered me water and a phone and the basic human courtesy my daughter-in-law had not. I was not powerless. I have never been powerless, though I've sometimes let people believe it. What I had was patience and information and the knowledge, built over a lifetime, that the most durable kind of strength is the kind that doesn't need to announce itself. Nicole had looked at me and made a calculation. That was her mistake. Not the cruelty of it, though that was real, but the assumption that followed the cruelty. The assumption that she had correctly assessed what she was dealing with. That kind of mistake is very hard to recover from, in my experience. The people who write you off before they've done their homework almost always find out why they shouldn't have. Eventually. It's just a question of when, and how, and whether they see it coming. Nicole did not see it coming. I think about that sometimes, and I won't pretend there is no satisfaction in it, because there is. But the satisfaction isn't the point. The point is that Daniel calls me every Sunday. The point is, Saturday mornings and strawberries and the way he laughs now, more easily than he did for several years, at things that are actually funny. The point is that I am sitting on my back porch right now in the early evening, and the light is gold the way it gets in late spring, and my tea is hot, and I have made no decisions. I regret. The waiting room chairs at Mercy General are still the hard plastic kind. I know because I was back there in March for a follow-up, and this time Daniel drove me. We were 20 minutes early. He brought coffee in a thermos and made bad jokes about the parking garage elevator, and when I came out after my appointment, he was right there in the lobby, standing up before I was even through the door. That is the whole of what I wanted. That, and the knowledge that I built something real and protected it, and taught my son, in the end, what careful attention to the right things looks like. Gerald would have agreed with how I handled it. He was not a sentimental man, but he understood that values without structure are just feelings, and feelings don't compound. The money is still there. The holdings, the structures, the quiet weight of 30 years of careful work, all of it intact, all of it patient, waiting for the right moment and the right hands. Daniel knows more now than he did a year ago. He'll know more next year than he does today. We'll get there. We have time.